Hello, and welcome to the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget's virtual event on the impact of the Harris and Trump campaign plans. The next president will face enormous fiscal challenges, yet both candidates have put forward policies that would increase debt and put fiscal sustainability further out of reach. Shortly, you will hear from Senior Vice President and Senior Policy Director Marc Goldwein, who will present our findings from our newest U.S. Budget Watch paper, which I'm sure most of you have already seen. Since we published last week, the analysis has been cited by 100 major media outlets, leading to over 2,000 syndicated mentions. This analysis was also used to question both candidates directly about their plans and has driven the fiscal conversation. I'm going to drop a link to our other U.S. Budget Watch work in the chat so you could explore all of the other published products. Following the presentation, Marc will take questions from the audience, so please be sure to submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I will do my best to ask him as many as possible. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Marc.
Well, thank you, everyone, for being here with us today. Chris, I want you to confirm with me I've got the right slide deck shared.
You do. It looks great, Marc.
Great, great. We've only been doing Zoom for 4 years now, so got to make sure we're getting it right. Um, let me start, I think, by setting the stage a little bit with some context. Then I want to tell everybody about what we found related to the campaign. So before we even get into anything proposed by either candidate, the next president is going to face sort of a, excuse me, a tremendous number of fiscal challenges. Just four of them really quick. Under the next president, we're likely to face record levels of debt, record levels growing, and in fact, record levels of interest payments as a share of the economy, looming trust fund insolvency, and major expirations of various tax cuts. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on all of these because I've talked about them before, and you can check out our website. We got some great papers. But just to give you some context, debt has historically been about 50% of GDP on average. It's gone up and down. After World War II, we hit it briefly 106% of GDP. We're going to hit that again during the next presidential term. And by 2035, projections suggest that debt is going to be at 125% of GDP, higher than it ever has. Meanwhile, our interest costs are surging. They're surging both because debt is higher, and so we're paying interest on more debt, and because interest rates are much higher today than they were in 2020 or even back in 2017, 2015. In fact, last year, the federal government spent more on interest than it spent on either the defense budget or on Medicare. We spent more servicing our past than defending our country. A couple of years ago, the interest budget passed all spending on children. So we spend more servicing our past than investing in our future. As mentioned, several major trust funds are also headed towards insolvency. The Highway Trust Fund around 2028, Medicare around 2036, Social Security's old age program around 2033. The law says when insolvency is reached, spending has to be cut down to revenue. For a typical newly retired couple in 2033, that would amount to a $16,500 cut in their annual benefits. And then lastly, next year, there's going to be all sorts of deadlines that the next president has to deal with. The debt limit is going to come back at the beginning of the year. The fiscal responsibility caps are going to end, and we're going to have to figure out how to fund the government. And then at the end of the year, large numbers of tax cuts and spending, especially from the 2017 tax bill, will expire. Extending all of those could cost $4 or $5 trillion, even more under some circumstances. And a lot of these issues are longstanding, especially Social Security and Medicare's looming insolvency. But a lot of it's also caused by the actions of our last two presidents. We, in a previous analysis, found that President Trump had signed into law about $8.5 trillion, law or executive action, about $8.5 trillion of new 10-year debt. About half of that was non-COVID, half of that was COVID related. President Biden signed into law another $4.5 trillion of debt, again, about half COVID, half non-COVID, if you count the American Rescue Plan in that COVID bucket. President Biden's number would be larger, but for the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the bipartisan legislation that capped defense and non-defense discretionary spending that we hope will hold, but may break apart in the coming months and years. So that's sort of what they face. Now, for the last year or so, we've been running this U.S. Budget Watch project, which we do every 4 years. to try to track not just what the candidates face, but what they are proposing. And here I want to give a special shout out to two of my colleagues, John Schuler, who runs this project, and Jay Zaleski, who has done just a tremendous amount of work on it. The two of them and my entire policy team have painstakingly gone through the campaign websites of both candidates, started in the primaries and continued into the general, and tried to find every single policy that the candidate has called for, either candidate has called for. We start with their issues pages and the major links on their websites. We identify policies that we think could have any kind of fiscal impact. And then we search for more detail to try to understand those policies, because campaigning is not the same as legislative language. So we look to speeches, we look to interviews, we look to white papers that may be released from the campaigns, things they've said to the media. Sometimes we look to past proposals they put out in their budgets, not to figure out what they're recommending, but to figure out the details behind what they're recommending. And we've been collecting this stuff for, as I said, about a year now. And last week, we felt like we had enough information that we put out a comprehensive analysis of the candidates' campaign plans as they stood a week ago. And this is the only comprehensive analysis out there that looks at all the tax policies, all the spending policies, essentially everything that they've called for. Now, what did we find? First of all, let me say that, as I mentioned before, there's an incredible amount of uncertainty with this stuff. Not only because different estimators can come up with different numbers, but also because it's not always clear what a candidate means when they put forward a policy. So, for example, Vice President Harris has said and regularly says that she wants there to be a national paid family and medical leave program. But she hasn't said how many weeks of paid family and medical leave you would get. She hasn't said how large the benefit would be. Similarly, President Trump has talked about putting more money into housing, and including with the tax credit, but he hasn't specifically said how. So we need to look to other similar proposals to try to understand what they're meaning. And often we sort these between a high cost estimate, which I think is sort of the least generous interpretation of their language, a low cost estimate, which is the most generous interpretation of their language, and a central estimate, which is our best guess at what they're talking about. We also talked to both the campaigns. Neither of them endorsed our analysis and said this is exactly right, but both campaigns did provide helpful feedback to help us understand some of these policies. In our central estimates, we found that over a 10-year period, President Trump's agenda, if enacted in full, would add $7.5 trillion to the debt, and Vice President Harris's agenda, if enacted in full, would add $3.5 trillion to debt. This comes with a wide range. For President Trump, we think basically somewhere between 1.4 and $15 trillion over a decade. For Vice President Harris, somewhere between budget neutral and $8 trillion over a decade. Again, this wide range reflects different estimates, but also different interpretations of their policies. Here you can see a comparison table. I recommend going to crfb.org and checking out this full paper. But here's a comparison table where you can kind of see them next to each other. You see both candidates use a large share of revenue on extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or extending significant parts of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That's $3 trillion for Vice President Harris, over $5 trillion for President Trump. But they both also have other tax cuts, both for businesses and for individuals. They both have some increases in healthcare spending. They both would strengthen border security. And then they both have offsets. President Trump's offsets, mainly in the form of tariffs. Vice President Harris, mainly in the form of taxes on high earners and corporations. That was the central estimate. I also just want to show you here briefly our high and low cost estimates. Our central estimate is our best guess, our best understanding of their policies. But the incredible amount of uncertainty, I think, really necessitates giving a range. And this range is really important to understand sort of the high and low of what they might mean. So I want to now dig into some of the details, and I'll start with Vice President Harris and then go through President Trump. In addition to this major paper that we released, we've also put out a few explainers along the way as the candidates have put out some policies. And so I want to do deep dive into a few of those specifics and then give you more general. For Vice President Harris, one of the first specific things that she came out with after after gaining the nomination, or maybe technically even before gaining the nomination, was a plan to raise the minimum wage and to exempt tip income from income taxes. She hasn't specifically said how high she would raise the minimum wage, although a lot of folks point to $15 an hour. They have, at the campaign level, offered some more specificity to this no tax on tips, which is that it would apply to the income tax, not the payroll tax. And there would be some kind of income cutoff and other kinds of guardrails. So this was really focused on low and middle income service workers and people that typically get tips. We estimate that depending on some of those details, this policy would lose between 100 and 200 billion, or would cost between 100 and 200 billion dollars over a decade before accounting for behavioral effects. But we also assume that if you reduce taxes on tips, there will be more tip income. And so with behavioral effects, once we account for income reclassifying, that cost could go up. Vice President Harris also released a major plan a few weeks later to lower costs for American families. This plan included all sorts of stuff. She would raise the child tax credit from $2,000 up to $3,000 for older kids, $3,600 for younger kids, $6,000 for newborns. She expands the earned income tax credit, expand the subsidies, extends the Affordable Care Act subsidy expansion that's currently in effect but expires at the end of the year. Do a bunch of stuff on housing, including a $25,000 first-time homebuyer tax credit, along with other kinds of tax policies and a new investment innovation fund. And she would lower prescription drug costs, especially by taking what we're doing right now to negotiate drug prices and accelerating that, doing that sooner. We did the math on this policy, and we think that taken together, these proposals would add about $1.7 trillion to the deficit over a decade. Just these proposals, not her whole plan. That's the net of about $2 trillion of things that would cost money and $250 billion of savings from lowering prescription drug costs. I should mention that her first-time homebuyer tax credit is only a 4-year tax credit. If it were made permanent, that cost would go up a little bit to about $2 trillion. Vice President Harris has also talked about some ways that she would reduce the deficit under her plan. And in particular, she's talked about some taxes on capital income. Currently, the top ordinary rate on capital gains is 20%. It is paid when you sell the stock. If you die without selling the stock, you get stepped up basis, so your kids don't ever pay that tax. And there's also a 1% tax on stock buybacks, which is meant to try to approximate the tax we currently have of 20% on dividends. Vice President Harris would raise that top rate from 20% to 28% on income above $1 million. She would increase that buyback tax from 1% to 4%. And she also supports a new, they call it a billionaire minimum tax, but essentially it's a tax on unrealized capital gains, a tax on the growth in stocks and other assets that hasn't been sold. This would only apply to very wealthy households. And because it's a minimum tax at, we think, 25%, it wouldn't necessarily tax all of the money at once, but it'd be sort of prepayment on taxing realized gains. These policies, plus taxing capital gains at death, which the Harris campaign hasn't said explicitly, but we believe is part of their plan based on their support for the Biden budget, would raise about $900 billion, be about $750 billion if you don't count that tax on capital gains at death. Vice President Harris has also proposed a bunch of stuff besides that. She's proposed to expand border security by supporting the bipartisan border security bill. She has a new plan for tax credits and loans and other kinds of investments to support research and manufacturing, expanded tax breaks for small businesses, including increasing that startup deduction from $5,000 to $50,000. She talks regularly about affordable or universal pre-K and childcare. She specifically said that childcare costs would be limited to 7% of income. We assume that means for some households based on how it's been done in recent legislation. She's talked about national paid family and medical leave. She's talked about affordable quality education, including reducing the burden of student debt. And recently, actually, after this report, she released a plan for long-term care to support at-home nursing care for the elderly and disabled, as well as expanding Medicare to support vision and healthcare. We estimated that these policies together in our base case would cost about $7 trillion total. This is our base case again. Sometimes there's a lot of specifics, as with the child tax credit or the border security bill. Sometimes it's more vague, as with childcare or paid leave, in which case we are often looking at the president's budget to get guidance or other similar legislation. So we have a range here from about 5 to 10 trillion, with our central estimate being about 7 trillion. She would pay for this not only with those higher taxes on capital income, but also higher taxes on corporations, raising that corporate rate from 21 to 28%. She would pay for it with international tax reforms, a stronger global minimum tax, taxes to help fund Medicare, including raising the Medicare payroll tax rate from 3.8 to 5% for higher earners, and applying it to more types of investment income and pass-through income. And the campaign has also said they support the other tax increases from the Biden budget. And this includes domestic minimum tax, IRS funding to do more tax gap, tax compliance things, limits on compensation taxes, and all sorts of other little stuff. We think together with her drug savings, this would save about $4 trillion. When you add in the interest cost of her agenda, we think overall her plan and our central estimate would add about $3.5 trillion to the debt, with, again, that range being anywhere from budget neutral on the low end to 8.1 trillion on the high end. The plan on average would keep spending at about current law level. Keep revenue at about current law level. Now, you might be curious, how can she have all these tax increases and barely increase revenue? The reason is that those tax increases largely go to extend the TCJA for people making less than $400,000 a year. That policy alone, in our base case, we estimate is $4 trillion. Depending on the design, it could be, $3 trillion. Depending on the design, it could be 2 to 4 trillion. But in our base case, we think that extending the TCJA under $400,000 is $3 trillion. And so most of her new tax increases are going for that and for some of our other tax breaks. Meanwhile, spending under the Harris agenda would rise pretty significantly as a result of the child care and paid leave and long-term care and other agenda items. You add this all up, we do think deficits will rise under the Harris plan. Under current law, deficits will go from about 2 trillion a year at the beginning of the decade to about 3 trillion by 2035. Under the Harris plan, we think it'll go to about 3.5 trillion. So deficits will be higher under her plan. And as a result, so too will debt. Under current law, debt will rise to 125% of GDP. Our base estimate for the Harris plan is it will rise to 133% of GDP, with a range of anywhere from 125, meaning the same as current law, to 144%. So that's the Harris plan. Now let me talk a little bit about the Trump plan and then how it all comes together. And then I would love to have some time for questions. But President Trump has also issued a number of specific policies. And then on top of that, we've gone through his entire agenda, which is largely the GOP platform, plus subsequent policy announcements. One recent policy that President Trump has proposed is to get rid of taxes on Social Security benefits. Currently, Social Security benefits are partially counted as income for purposes of the income tax. Basically, if you make over $25,000 or $32,000 for a couple, half of your Social Security benefits can count as income. If you make over $44,000, up to 85% of your Social Security benefits are counted as income. It's a little more complicated because of what counts and what doesn't. But the basic idea here is Social Security benefits are partially accounted as income and it's partially subject to that income tax. And the money from that income tax is then flowed back through to help finance Social Security and to finance Medicare. President Trump would eliminate that tax. We estimate that using CBO numbers, eliminating that tax in isolation, would add about $1.6 trillion to the deficit over a decade. Using the trustees' numbers, would be more like $1.8 trillion. That alone would increase Social Security's 75-year shortfall by 25%, almost 1% of payroll. It would triple Medicare's shortfall, increasing by 0.5% of payroll, and it would advance the insolvency of both those trust funds. In addition to no taxes on Social Security, President Trump has also proposed no taxes on overtime pay. Right now, hourly workers in many cases, in almost all cases, in fact, hourly workers in most cases who work more than 40 hours are required to be paid time and a half for hours in excess of 40, meaning they get paid 150% as much per hour beyond their first 40 hours of work. President Trump has said he wants to eliminate taxes on overtime. We know from subsequent information from the vice president and also from discussions with the campaign that this would apply to both the income and payroll tax. And there would be some guardrails to stop sort of the most egregious abuses of this. Now, what do I mean by abuses of this? Well, under a circumstance where all income, overtime income, is subject to no tax, salaried workers are going to switch in droves, in theory, to hourly income. Salaried workers that work more than 40 hours a week are going to have a huge incentive to switch over to hourly. Here, I've kind of shown an illustrative example of somebody that works 50 hours and is currently paid $110,000 a year. If they were to work the exact same number of hours and get the same exact take-home pay by restructuring their income, they could cut their taxes by essentially $8,000 just by switching. And so we'd imagine significant switching, significant behavioral effects, both from people switching the way they're paid, but also on top of that for some fibbing about how many hours folks are working, and some gaming in terms of how much they work in a given week versus another week. So for example, I might take 3 shifts in one week and 2 shifts in another week to try to maximize my overtime pay and overtime tax cuts. Now, guardrails would limit this, but of course it matters how. And so we looked at a variety of different guardrails, everything from limiting the number of hours you could get this tax cut for to limiting who was eligible. And we basically came up with all sorts of very rough estimates depending on those guardrails. Bottom line, and this is very unsatisfying, this could cost anywhere from 250 billion as on the low end with intense guardrails and no behavior, to $6 trillion with no guardrails and extreme behavior. Extreme behavior meaning everybody switches all of their work to hourly. Obviously, the number is going to be somewhere in between, and we ran some of those numbers as well. And our base case assumes it's about $2 trillion, which is consistent with what some others have found as well. Lastly, and this is sort of a major part of Trump's platform, President Trump has talked about paying for lots of his platform with tariffs, import fees, a 10% baseline universal tariff that applies to basically all imports. Sometimes he said 20%, a 60% tariff on Chinese imports, reciprocal tariffs on other countries that have imposed tariffs on us. And then there's been additional discussion, 100% tariff on Mexican-made cars, 100% tariff on countries move away from the dollar. More recently, we've heard President Trump talk about 50 to 200%. We've even heard him say 1,000, 2,000% tariffs. Not every one of these discussions is clearly a real policy. And the president has said so himself. President Trump has said a lot of times this is figure of speech. But they all point in the same direction, that clearly the president is proposing pretty significant tariffs, enough tariffs to effectively get the job done. The job for him, I think, to be moving a lot of manufacturing and other stuff domestically. We modeled these first 3 parts of this, the 10% baseline tariff, the 60% Chinese tariff, and the reciprocal tariffs. These are all tariffs that President Trump has talked about over and over again, are included in some form on his website or elsewhere. They're also all tariffs that would raise money. A lot of these other tariffs would actually lose money. And we estimate that together they would raise something like $2.5 to $3 trillion, $2.7 trillion in our base case. When you account for, and I should also mention that other estimators from Penn Wharton to Yale Budget Lab to the Tax Policy Center to Tax Foundation have come to very similar conclusions. When you account for economic effects, the fact that higher tariffs is likely to reduce economic activity, that number could go down. But of course, if it's a 20% instead of a 10% tariff, that number could go up. When you look at the President Trump's entire agenda, what we found is that a large share of it is just extending the TCJA. He proposed not only extending all of the expiring individual provisions of the TCJA for $4 trillion, but letting some of the pay-fors, in particular the cap on the state and local tax deduction, that $10,000 cap, expire. He's also proposed extending or reviving some business provisions, but only for domestic manufacturers. Combined, that's over $5 trillion. In our base case, we think no taxes on overtime is another $2 trillion. Any taxes on Social Security benefits is somewhat less than in what I showed you earlier because there's interactions, but it's still another $1 to $1.5 trillion. He's proposed a 15% corporate rate for domestic production, which we think if it's only on domestic manufacturing would be $200 billion. No taxes on tips, stronger, bigger military, including with a U.S. Iron Dome, a mass deportation of immigrants and stronger border security, and some other stuff. We add this all together, it looks like about $10 trillion in our base case, with a range of $7 to $16 trillion. The offsets are mainly those tariffs I've already mentioned, which we think are about 2.7 trillion, but could be anywhere from 2 to 4, 4.5. President Trump would also get rid of the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. He talks about this in the form of, and their platform talks about repealing Biden's Green New Deal, and repealing his EV mandate, which we interpret as repealing the spending and tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act and repealing the car vehicle emissions rule. That's most of the savings. There's also, President Trump would also get rid of the Department of Education, reduce waste, fraud, and abuse, which we've looked to what he's done in previous budgets on that. Taken together, we think these policies would save about $3.5 to $4 trillion, $3.7 trillion with a range of 2.5 to 5.5. Add in interest, and the whole plan would add $7.5 trillion to the debt, with a range of $1.5 to $15 trillion in our low and high estimates. Sort of the opposite situation from Vice President Harris. Spending under President Trump's plan would actually stay at about current law through 2032 or so. Then it would rise somewhat above current law, largely because interest costs are rising. Revenue would be way below current law. So current law revenue is projected to rise from 17% to 18% of GDP. If you were to extend the current tax cut to be about 17%, President Trump basically doubles down on that, and so his revenue would be at closer to 16%. Deficits under his plan would rise to $4 trillion by the end of the decade, as opposed to $3 trillion under current law. And debt, we estimate, instead of rising to 125% of GDP, would rise to 142%, with that range of 128 to 160%. I also should mention that specific to President Trump's plans, the Social Security and Medicare trust funds would be in significantly worse financial shape. Just from repealing the taxation of Social Security benefits, we estimate the Social Security Trust Fund would run out of money about a year earlier, 2032 instead of 2033. And the Hospital Insurance Trust Fund would run out of money 6 years earlier, 2030 instead of 2036. If you were to add in the effects of the payroll tax cuts for tips, no payroll tax on tips, no payroll tax for overtime, the restrictions on immigration, which will reduce the number of people paying payroll taxes, and the inflation effects of the tariffs, which would flow through to cost of living adjustments, you'd expect to see an even sooner insolvency date for these programs. We are working on an analysis of that, and I promise that you'll be the first to see it when it comes out. When you stack these candidates next to each other, I think what you see is that neither candidate has a plan for reducing the debt or for addressing the growth of the debt. In fact, under our central estimate of both candidates' plans, they would increase the debt further on top of current law. Vice President Harris by $3.5 trillion, President Trump by significantly more than double as much, $7.5 trillion. They would both increase spending. President Trump mainly through the higher interest cost, Vice President Harris mainly through new spending programs. President Trump would significantly reduce revenue. Vice President Harris would keep revenue about flat, but really switch where the revenue is coming from. And they would both add to the deficit. This is deficits as a share of GDP. You can see that deficits are already headed towards 7% of GDP, which really is way above where they've ever been outside of a war or recession or one-time pandemic. Under Vice President Harris's plan, they'd further increase to 8%. Under President Trump's plan to 9.5%. I should say our year by years are less certain than our debt numbers. So I would take these, give or take a few decimal points, but they're order of magnitude what the plans would do. And if you see it here in dollars, instead of heading to $3 trillion under current law, it'd be $3.5 trillion under Vice President Harris's plan and $4 trillion under President Trump's plan. Both plans would increase the debt. In any circumstance, debt will rise. And in almost any circumstance for either candidate, debt will rise faster than current law, and faster under most interpretations of President Trump's plan than most interpretation of Vice President Harris's plans. What does this mean for the long run? We have not done an analysis yet for this, but I think it's important to show you illustratively how bad debt could get if we started adding $3.5 and $7.5 trillion to the debt. So I want to be clear again, this is illustrative. We have not estimated the effects of their plans in the long term. what we did is we took the component parts of their plan and basically put them into their categories. So revenue, healthcare, spending. And we said, okay, what if those categories continue to grow at their same rate, but from these new bases? And in that circumstance, illustratively to understand where we're going, debt would reach about 190% of GDP under current law. It would breach 210% under sort of an extrapolation of the Harris plan in our central estimate. And it would reach 250% under a illustrative extrapolation of the Trump plan. But actually, if we were to continue in this course, the situation would be worse. What we know about debt is that as debt goes up, it pushes up interest rates, it pushes down the growth rate. If we were to sort of make a extreme illustrative assumption that we roll over the debt each year, the literature basically says that every percentage point increase in the debt increases interest rates by 2.5 basis points. So this again is just to show you illustratively, what if we were to roll over the debt each year and look at the effects on interest rates? What you would see is the debt would rise even faster. And if we were to go out another 10 or 20 years, I think what you would see is they'd really start to hockey stick to not just an unsustainable place, but to a place of no return. Now, this isn't only the fault of the candidates. This is the underlying fiscal situation that is in many ways unaffordable. But both candidates, Trump more so than Harris under our estimates, but both candidates would take a bad situation and make it significantly worse to the point that if we were to enact either of their agendas in full in our central estimate and not take future corrective action, we could be facing some kind of debt spiral in the not all too distant future. So on that cheery note, I would love to take any questions. And again, I just want to thank everybody on my team at the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget here for all their hard work in putting this paper together, and encourage you to check out the website and read the paper, which really does a deep dive on all of these policies.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, for that really informative presentation. We have a bunch of questions coming in, but let's start off with Sylvia, who asked, you talked a lot about the budgetary effects of the candidate plans, but what would the economic effects of their plans be? How do you think their plans would affect output and inflation?
Yeah, this is a great question. So our estimates were focused on the 10-year fiscal impact of these plans. How much will they increase spending? How much will they reduce revenue? But obviously, when you change fiscal policy so much, there are going to be economic effects. We haven't done the analysis on this, but I would speculate based on what we know that both candidates, at least over the long run, would shrink the economy. And I think that's probably true for a couple of reasons. One is really mechanical. Is both candidates, President Trump more than Vice President Harris, both candidates would restrict immigration, and that would reduce the number of workers, and so that would sort of mechanically reduce GDP. Whether that increased or reduced income per person is sort of a matter of debate in the economics community, but it would reduce the number of people and so reduce GDP. But there's two other reasons. The one is that both candidates propose tax increases that are, on average, probably more distorting than the tax cuts they are undistorting. In other words, the tax increases in the form of tariffs for President Trump and in the form of kind of pretty high taxes on investment and corporate income for Vice President Harris would probably do more to reduce the growth in the economy than the tax cuts they both proposed would do to increase growth, even though they would have in both directions. But then the key reason over the long run is the debt. There's really a direct link between high levels of debt and slow economic growth over the long run. The reason for that is that when the federal government has to issue treasuries, people are buying that instead of investing in the private sector. This is called crowd out, and that leads to slower income growth over time. So while both candidates have policies that would be pro-growth and policies that would be anti-growth, on net, my best guess is that over the long run, at least, both candidates would reduce the size of the economy relative to where it otherwise would be. As for inflation, for a similar reason, I would expect both candidates, President Trump more so than Harris, would be inflationary. They'd be inflationary because of the deficit impact, because of the immigration restriction, which reduces that labor supply, and then in the case of President Trump, because these tariffs, which sort of add a direct mechanical add-on to the price of things. I also think that in the very near term, it's possible that both candidates would boost the economy through this deficit effect. That can be helpful in the very near term to create more demand. And although we're not out of our current inflation crisis, the economy is maybe normalized enough that it could absorb some of that temporarily for a boost in output. But I don't think that would be very long lived.
Great. So Chris M wants to know, voters don't seem to be concerned about record deficits and debts. What could be the impact of these rising deficits on the typical American if this issue is not addressed?
Yeah. So the thing about debt is that normally its negative effects are very slow moving until they're not, right? And when I say until they're not, what we saw, the inflation crisis that we saw in 2021 and 2022 in particular, was driven in part, possibly in large part, by very large deficits. The recent surge we're seeing in interest payments, right? Interest payments have basically doubled over the last few years. We now spend more in interest than on defense or kids. That happened very fast. And a fiscal crisis, were we to have one, would happen really fast. In the meanwhile, what we also see is kind of sort of slow moving, but really important negative effects of debt. One is that debt pushes up interest rates. And that doesn't just spell higher costs to the federal government. It means higher mortgage rates, higher car loan rates, higher business loan rates. And Americans are seeing that every day now as you go and buy a house and you see how high interest rates are. The second is it slows economic growth. Not very much in any given year, but over time cumulatively. So the Congressional Budget Office has kind of looked at a scenario where debt is flat, a scenario where debt is rising pretty rapidly. And they think 30 years down the line, the rapidly growing scenario will cut about a third of our economic growth and reduce income per person by $10,000 or $11,000. That's not per worker, that's per person, right? So if you figure that less than half of us are workers, it's really more like $20,000 per worker, maybe even $25,000 per worker. That's a tremendous loss. And it wouldn't be all at once. It would be through gradually slower growth either year. And I think it's kind of incumbent on all of us, especially those of us here at CRFB, to kind of help the public to wake up to this, because it is such a slow moving crisis that there's a risk of the frog in the pot situation where the frog doesn't realize that the water's boiling until it's too late. And we need to coax our leaders to acting now before the water hits that boiling point.
Great. Mac R wants to know, and this ties into some of our other work, has either candidate proposed tougher enforcement of existing tax law? He has seen evasion and avoidance numbers as high as 500 to 750 billion per year in unpaid taxes, and wants to know if we have a position on this.
That's a great question. So the easiest way in the world to raise tax, maybe not the easiest, the best way in the world to raise taxes, in my opinion, to raise revenue, is to enforce the tax code that we already have, right? Because then you're actually collecting more money without raising anyone's taxes. You're just reducing cheating. Now, of course, that could be taken to an extreme. We don't want to, be auditing everybody, every single American. But there's so much more we can do to enforce the tax code. The Inflation Reduction Act took a step in that direction. It funded the IRS to increase its enforcement. And we're starting to see that pay some dividends. Vice President Harris has endorsed the Biden budget. The Biden budget would extend that funding and would also make some other changes. But neither candidate has proposed some kind of wholesale change to collection. One more thing I will say about this is that this really should be bipartisan. We've looked at this in every single president from Ronald Reagan through Joe Biden. So that includes like Reagan, Bush, and Trump, as well as Clinton, Obama, and Biden. Every single one of them proposed efforts to improve tax compliance, including more funding to the IRS and other kinds of measures. And this is one of the low-hanging fruits when it comes to tax collection.
Great. We have a question from Donna who wants to know how much more would need to be done to fix the pending insolvency of Social Security if former President Trump's no tax on Social Security plan were to be enacted.
Yeah. So getting rid of taxes on Social Security expands its funding gap by about a quarter. So if you think about it now, if we were to try to save Social Security now entirely with benefit cuts, just illustratively, we'd have to cut all benefits by about 20%. Under President Trump's plan, you'd have to cut all benefits by about 25%, starting immediately to get to the same place. So it just moves us in the wrong. And you can do the same kind of math on the tax side, right? We'd have to increase the taxes by about a third. And under President Trump's plan, you have to increase them by about 40%. So it just makes the problem larger. It also makes it sooner. We already are only 9 years away from insolvency. That's when today's youngest retirees turn 71. So this isn't about like saving Social Security for your grandkids. It's about saving Social Security for your grandparents. Um, if if you were to get rid of tax on Social Security benefits, we'd only have 8 years, maybe even 7 years. We are really running out of time to fix this problem, and we need solutions that move in the right direction, either by bringing in more revenue, by reducing or slowing the growth of benefits, or, my opinion, some combination of the two. And what we're seeing is that the candidates are either saying they're not going to touch Social Security at all, which to me is endorsing insolvency. It's endorsing a 21% across the board cut, or they're saying they would actually make the situation worse. And that's not helpful to anybody.
Great. So Fred B has a technical question about US debt to GDP, and he says he's seen it quoted at different amounts, sometimes as high as at 125%. Can you explain quickly the differences between those different methods?
Yep. So there are different ways that we measure the national debt. And the two largest ones are one called gross debt. And that is sort of all obligations in the form of debt of the US government, including what it owes itself. And when I say owes itself, I mean money in the Social Security Trust Fund, money in the Medicare Trust Fund. This is money that we owe ourselves. And then there's debt held by the public, which basically says, if my right hand owes my left hand $1, the net effect is zero because I got $1 of debt over here, dollar debt over here and $1 of assets over here, that nets to zero. As economists, we prefer to use debt held by the public, which is about 99%. There are uses for that gross federal debt. It tells us our obligations a little bit better. It's not perfect, but a little bit better. It's what the debt limit is tied to, which is more legally binding. So there are values to that gross debt, but we generally tend to use debt held by the public because we think that's a more meaningful measure of how debt is actually affecting the economy.
Very helpful. We've had a lot of different questions kind of poking at the immigration issue, obviously being discussed a lot. So I thought maybe just kind of put them all together how would you see immigration playing out with the fiscal situation? And are there ways to improve our fiscal situation through immigration?
Yeah, so let me first talk about what we found from the candidates, which is that actually both candidates, which I think is a first, I've been doing this since 2008. And I think for the first time, both candidates are really focused on border security. Vice President Harris has endorsed the bipartisan border security bill, which would aim to kind of reduce the inflow. We have seen a recent pretty large surge in immigration. President Trump would go much further. He would work to deport people that are currently here in large amounts. He would also really beef up border security, build a wall, defund benefits that currently go to a lot of immigrants, defund sanctuary cities, things like that. So they're not the same magnitude, but they both go in the same direction. And when we looked at the Harris plan, what we found is that there's about 40 billion of direct costs associated with her plan. But there'd be an additional indirect cost because it turns out that at the federal level, in the near term, immigrants are sort of a net gain for the budget. That doesn't talk about the long term, and it doesn't talk about the state and local level, but the federal level, they're a net gain. And the reason is that they pay a lot more in taxes than they receive in federal benefits. There aren't very many federal budget benefits they're eligible for. And so restricting them, we think Harris's plan overall would increase the deficit by about 100 billion in our base case and up to 200 billion in our high cost. President Trump, we look at the direct things that he's proposed, and there's a lot of things that would be really costly, like deportations are really expensive because you need to find the people, you need to go through the hearings, you need to do the transportation, all sorts of stuff, really expensive. Building a wall would be pretty expensive. There's also a lot of things that would save money, not providing benefits to immigrants, not providing benefits to cities that are providing benefits to immigrants. That would save a lot of money. And so we look at President Trump's kind of the direct effect, and it's actually not clear to us whether it would save money or cost money. We think it would cost a little bit, but not that much. But the indirect effect could be significantly larger than Vice President Harris's. And there's a lot of uncertainty. In our base case, we basically came to the conclusion that he could plausibly reverse about half of the surge in the recent immigration. And so we estimated that would cost about $350 billion. Our high cost estimate assumes he's able to reverse the entire surge, and it counts macroeconomic effects. And we think it cost upward of $1 trillion. So the bottom line is both of these candidates actually, we think, would try to stem immigration to different degrees. And in both cases, that would actually cost the federal government money and reduce the amount of revenue coming in.
Great. Rob has an interesting question asking if there's any kind of lessons that could be learned from the current fiscal situation happening in France right now.
I'm not an expert on what's currently happening in France, um, but I would be cautious about taking too many cautionary tales. I know that they tried to raise the retirement age, and there was a um, big backlash. France has a really different um, ethic about work than the United States, and so I wouldn't expect the same kind of backlash here. Although I understand whenever you make changes, there's always some people that won't find them popular. But I'm otherwise not really an expert on what's going on in France.
Fair enough. Julie had a more direct question. Do you have an ideal level of debt to GDP and what it should be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I get asked this a lot because the truth is the ideal level of debt is not zero. Just like a business, just like in a household, there's good reasons for the U.S. government to have debt, and there's additional good reasons, including that the Treasury is the backbone of the global financial system. But we should be borrowing when there's emergencies and spreading the cost over time. We should be borrowing when the economy is weak and we want to help boost it. And there's other times that we don't necessarily should be borrowing, but it's okay for us to borrow in other times, so long as our debt is growing slower than the economy. My big problem now is that the debt is growing faster than the economy in good times, which means it's going to grow even faster than in bad times, which means there's a risk that as the debt pushes up interest rates, we have a debt spiral. I don't have an ideal level of debt, but I think a good place to start would be let's stabilize debt at 100% of GDP. Let's instead of rising to 125 as it's projected to, let's keep it below the size of the economy. Then let's gradually get it down. 60% is a kind of common international target. I can't promise you there's anything magic about it. Like, do I really care if we're at 55 or 65? I don't. But I'd like to be in the place that I feel like the debt is low enough that we can borrow when we have those future needs, whether it's the next recession or some kind of war or a pandemic or something we haven't even thought of yet. And so if we could start by stabilizing and then get down towards 60%, I could go on a very long vacation somewhere.
Great. So Mark H wants to know, how would you assess fiscal policy risks to the states and the likely impact on federal funds flows under these different trajectories?
That's a great question I hadn't really thought of because what's done at the federal level can affect the states. It can affect them both directly and affect them indirectly because a lot of states conform their tax code to the federal government unless you tell them otherwise. So, for example, if we were to do no taxes on tips, no taxes on Social Security benefits, no taxes on overtime, um, no SALT cap, things like that, changes to the tax code, that could affect some state tax codes in a variety of ways. And if we were to restrict immigration, that would have different types of effects. Remember, I said the federal level, immigrants are a net gain. That's not necessarily true at the state and local level because most of the services that immigrants get are for things like public school that are paid mainly at the local level. And so that's a great question. I haven't kind of done the net of it. One thing I will say that is, to me is indisputable is a stronger economy is better for everyone. And I don't, while I do think both the candidates have particular proposals that would be good for the economy, I don't think either candidate has an agenda that in the whole would be good for the economy, in large part because of this debt load. And so I would hope that whoever wins, keeps the parts of their agenda that are the most pro-growth and figures out how to do the rest in a fiscally responsible and pro-growth manner. And that would not only help the federal government, but by growing the economy faster would help essentially every state and local government as well.
Great. So we're getting short on time, but we have time for a few more questions. Jim wants to know, which parts of these plans do you think may encounter the greatest resistance from the other side of the aisle if the given candidate is elected? And I imagine the answer is a lot of resistance, but how do you kind of see that the candidates as president would adjust to respond to those challenges? Will it make things worse? Can it possibly make things better?
Yeah, I want to say something clear that I should have at the beginning of this. Our estimates are not predictions of what will happen. They are estimates of what would happen if the candidates' plans were enacted in full. I think the chance that either candidate's plan is going to be enacted in full is about 0%, 0.00%. That's not going to happen. And so if you're thinking about kind of what the future looks like, obviously depends on which candidate wins the election, depends on what Congress they're facing. But you also should look through these specific policies and say, okay, which one of these are the most popular? No taxes on tips is now supported by both candidates. That puts that as now as kind of a high popularity policy. Um, Almost every economist hates it. So its popularity among economists is in the floor, but there's very few economists in Congress. So, you could see that as a likely one to happen. Something like tariffs, maybe less popular, but can be enacted in part, possibly in whole, without Congress. The president has some authority to enact tariffs on his own or her own. That authority is really meant to be used for national security purposes, but it's not really clear what that means. And so it's not that I would assume we're going to have a 10% baseline tariff, but I would assume if President Trump wins, you are going to see an increase in tariffs, in part because he doesn't need Congress to answer that. And then there's everything that's around kind of deadlines, and in particular, their Tax Cuts and Jobs Act plans, right? We may, in fact, let the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expire. And from a fiscal standpoint, that'd be a far better outcome than either of the candidates' plans. But I think it's likely that there is going to be some form of an extension. So what the candidates say here matters, because what the candidates say here may help to set the stage to dictate kind of the terms of debate for which parts are extended and what's included in it.
Jack R. would like to know, compared to previous elections, would you say the candidate plans this time around were more or less detailed? And what were some of your key challenges in performing this analysis?
Uh, that's a great question. I would say compared to 2008, 2012, or 2016, these candidates were less detailed. But it was kind of selective. They were very detailed in some areas and not detailed at all in others. And I think that's partially a virtue of the very kind of tightened campaign schedule with Vice President Harris not being the nominee until so late in the process. I think it's partially a factor of sort of the way that President Trump likes to talk about policy. He likes to talk in these generalities and kind of these big, all caps statements, as opposed to he's less of a white paper guy. But I would say overall, there's probably less detail than we've usually seen, not the least amount of detail. And it's not universal across policies. And that's the biggest challenge, because for both candidates, we had to take a statement like repeal the Green New Deal or universal paid family and medical leave and turn it into actual policy, right? They didn't tell us the policy. They told us enough to know that they want to do something. And then we need to figure out what that something actually is. And that's where we are lucky that both candidates have endorsed budgets, and the budgets do have to have a lot of detail. And so for Vice President Harris, we looked at statements and press interviews, and we talked to campaign staff. But when we couldn't figure it out from that, we looked at what was in the Biden budget, and that was sort of our central estimate. And then for our high and our low estimate, we looked to other policies around that kind of could reflect it. And similarly for President Trump, we sometimes look to his final budget of his time in office, or we look to similar policies that are around. But that did create challenges, and it's part of the reason you see such wide ranges in our estimates.
Great. Going to do a little bit of a rapid fire round of some quick questions. Carlos wants to know, does the government have other ways of raising revenue besides taxes?
Are you just going to ask me a bunch of questions?
Just like quick back and forth.
Not really. I mean, look, we can sell some assets. Faster economic growth can get us more of our existing taxes, but the vast majority of revenue we collect is always going to be from taxes.
What percentage of the debt is held by foreign entities?
About a third of our debt is held by foreign entities. China is the single largest holder. China and Japan kind of go back and forth sometimes. And China owns, I think, about 5% of our debt.
Are current treasury yields a reflection that the market doesn't think either of these plans is very likely to happen?
That's a great question. My observation with treasury markets is they are convinced that America will do the right thing once we've run out of options, right? That old saying, they're convinced that at some point we will take corrective action. They don't know when, but they don't need to know when. And so long as if your debt is rising forever, but eventually you're going to take corrective action, um, there's some premium associated with that over the interim, but it's just not very high. And so my sense is that markets still believe that at some point we're going to take action. And to be honest, I also believe that. I have to believe that. But it matters how, and it matters what's the percent chance that I'm wrong and that we don't take corrective action. And I don't think markets are appropriately reflecting that percent risk that they're wrong.
A couple of people have asked, can't we just print dollars to break even like other countries do? And then similarly, people have said, do you have any comment on modern monetary theory? So I just want to give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to go to treasury markets. We borrow our own currency, and we could choose to print that currency to finance our deficit. The consequences that we would have terrible inflation, and that's been true every time throughout history and around the world when this has been tried at scale. There's no quick fix. The bond markets have sort of the bond markets are helpful to us because um, they allow us to borrow and to deficit finance without that massive inflation until we go really overboard, as maybe we did in 2021. If we abandon those and try to print money, I think what you would see is very rapid inflation, and ultimately an abandonment of that approach.
Great. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I just wanted to say that, everybody who asked about our take on other proposals and other plans that may have come out recently, be sure to sign up for our emails, check out our website. We'll continue to publish some additional US Budget Watch pieces over the next couple of weeks. And then also somebody asked specifically about our interactive tools, which are all available on our website. And you could also check those out at crfb.org. The full recording of this webinar from start to finish will be published on our website as well, under previous events. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you found this as informative as I did.